Welcome to our final video in our series, The Story of Abraham. The climax having been reached in Genesis 22 with Abram's test on Mount Moriah, what follows in Genesis 23 to 25 amount essentially to an epilogue tying up loose ends in the story, moving the story towards its final resolution. I've entitled this epilogue Two Funerals and a Wedding, referring to the burials of Sarah and Abraham and the finding and betrothal of Rebekah to Isaac. Let's begin reading. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abram went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Now Sarah dies 37 years after giving birth to Isaac, and Abraham mourns her death. And then he says to the Hittites, whose land he is in, that he is a sojourner and a foreigner among them. This means he does not have any land. After all these years, the promised possession of the land is still just a promise. And so he asks them for property amongst them to serve as a burying place to bury Sarah. Abraham's request makes clear that even at the end of Sarah's life, and at his age of 137, 62 years after God had called him to go to Canaan and promised him the land, he had still not possessed any of the land that God had promised him. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. The Hittites recognized Abram as a prince of God among them, and I think this reflects the fact that God has been blessing his life, and they realize that blessings come through God to them. And they invite him, therefore, to bury Sarah in the choicest of their tombs. They're saying, use one of ours. Well, Abram rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, If you're willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. So Abraham bows down to them in deference and asks them to entreat Ephron to give him a specific cave, Machpelah. So he doesn't just want to use one of their tombs, he wants a cave to use as his own burying place. And he doesn't want to be given this cave, he wants to buy it at the full price. The narrative is paying a lot of attention to Abraham's negotiation for the purchase of a plot of land to bury Sarah, because it represents the first piece of the promised land that Abraham will acquire. And it serves as a token of his hope and God's promise that he will possess all of it. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. And Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, Of all who went in at the gate of his city, No, my Lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you, bury your dead. So Ephron counters that Abram can have the cave he wants with the field that it is in, but he offers to give it to Abraham instead of selling it. Then we read, Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the Lord, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I bury my dead there. Now Abraham bows down before the people again, and he says to Ephron, No, please let me give you the price of the field. That is, I don't want a gift, I want to pay for it. And he insists on paying for it, because if it is a gift, it can be taken back. Notice everything is being done in the hearing and the presence of the people. There are witnesses to this transaction to assure its validity, and there is within the conventions and the culture of that time, this is some sophisticated, very careful bargaining and negotiation without offending the other party. Well, Ephron answered Abraham, "My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Abram listened to Ephron, and Abram weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So Ephron says, the land is worth 400 shekels, but there's nothing between us. We both have money. Bury your dead. So he's named a price, but he's maintained this posture of saying Abram doesn't have to pay him for using the land. Abram immediately pays out the amount named as the price without negotiating. He's not haggling over this. And some scholars believe that the price is an inordinate amount. It is more than land would be sold for. But Abraham pays out the entire sum without any bargaining. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field of the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the land throughout its whole area was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. So Abraham acquires a small piece of real estate in Canaan finally, but as a burial place, as his possession. This happens in the presence of the Hittites in the gate of the city, where transactions take place and are witnessed. After this, Abram buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. So Abram acquires the land and he buries Sarah there. Her burial here, and later Abraham's burial, and Isaac's burial, and Rebekah's burial, and Jacob's burial, and Leah's burial represents the fact that they all hoped to take possession of this land beyond their death at some time in the future, because God had promised them possession of this land. And so the writer of Hebrews says, in Hebrews 11 and verse 8, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he's looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God." So Abraham, by faith, invests his life in God's promise and lived as an alien and a sojourner. Living in tents means he never possessed the land or acquired what was promised to him in terms of the land. And his son and his grandson also lived in this way. And he and them lived in this way because his hope was beyond his life. He was looking forward to an eternal city, the New Jerusalem. And so the writer of Hebrews continues in verse 13, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." So Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob all died in faith. That is, they were still believing. They died not receiving the things promised by God, such as possession of the promised land, but seeing and greeting them from afar, that is, by faith. They lived as strangers and exiles here, that is, this world was not their home. Their homeland was not Mesopotamia, because as the writer says, if they wanted to, they had opportunity to go back there, but they did not. But their homeland was a better country, a heavenly one. And so they died in faith, looking forward to that hope that God was going to fulfill beyond the grave. For many of us, we've made sacrifices like Abraham. And as we approach our later years and experience the death of our loved ones, we can feel dismay at having not received in this life the results that perhaps we expected from our sacrifices. We can learn from Abraham. He figured out that it was okay to die without seeing all of God's promises fulfilled, because he had come to know and trust God during the course of his journey. And he was so confident in God's faithfulness that he believed that God would fulfill his promise to him beyond the grave. And so he and the patriarchs were buried in the promised land in expectation that God would give them possession of that land. Jacob so believed this that in Genesis 49, he commanded his sons to take his body out of Egypt when they left to be buried in the promised land, and to bury him in the cave at Machpelah. And Joseph commanded his brothers to carry his bones with them at the time of the Exodus. Well, Sarah having died, and this being the end of an era, in Genesis 24, the narrative proceeds to describe the finding of a wife for Isaac. Now, Abram was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abram said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. As one of Abraham's last narrated acts, he takes steps to ensure a good succession with Isaac. Isaac needs a wife if Abram's offspring is to multiply as promised. But Abram wants to ensure not only that Isaac has offspring, but that he has godly offspring. And so he gets his servant to swear that he will find a wife for Isaac, but not from the Canaanites, because God had already told Abraham that the Canaanites would be dispossessed of the land when their wickedness reached the full measure. Instead, Isaac's wife was to be found among Abraham's relatives. So the servant said to Abraham, perhaps a woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abram said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The servant says, maybe the woman is not as adventurous or as faithful as you are to leave our family and come to a strange land. So if she doesn't want to come, can I take Isaac back to Mesopotamia? And Abram says emphatically, do not take my son back there. Abram is intent on his son remaining in the promised land because God has called him to live there with the promises that his offspring would one day possess it. Even in his old age, he's concerned to protect and pursue the promises of God in his life and his descendants' life, even beyond his death. And so he says to the servant, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. Abraham is confident in the God that he has served, that God would provide. And so he releases the servant from any obligation if he does not find a wife to come back, because he's confident that God will provide. He says, but if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you'll be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. Abraham says, if God doesn't bring a woman back, then you are free from this oath. Whatever happens, do not bring Isaac back there. Well, the story then moves on to show us God's providence in enabling the servant to find Rebekah. She's a daughter of Milcah and the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. And what happens is that the servant, when he gets to Nahor's town, he prays to Yahweh for a hospitable young woman to be the one. In his prayer, he says, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my father, my master Abraham. Behold, I'm standing in the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." Well, what happens next is Rebekah, just as he prays that, who's the daughter of Bethuel and granddaughter of Nahor and Milcah, she arrives. And she demonstrates frenzied hospitality, which is reminiscent of Abraham with the 3 visitors. She's running all over the place. She's feeding camels with gallons of water. She's hospitable. She's industrious. She's active. She is of the right family. She is of the right age. She's never been with a man. She is whom Abraham's son is looking for. Well, Rebekah at the well is parallel, strangely, to Jacob at the well, who, when he gets to the well in Mesopotamia, he has to drive off, he has to move a huge stone. And she's parallel to Moses, who has to drive off unruly shepherds to let his wife Zipporah drink from, get water from the well. But Isaac is missing. As we've said, he is very passive. And so Rebekah is demonstrated to be the one who's going to be the active one in the relationship and in their marriage. And like Abraham, we will discover that she is willing to leave her family and her country to go where she is called. The servant says when the family agrees to let her marry Isaac, he says, "Well, let's go now." And her brother and her mother said, "Let the young woman remain with us for a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go." But the servant said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." And they said, "Let us call the young woman and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will go." She's being like Abraham. When Abraham is called by God to leave Mesopotamia, his country, his kindred, his father's household, to go to Canaan on just God's word, here we find Rebekah having a similar faith, to leave all her security, to go because Yahweh has called her to be with Isaac. And so they sent away Rebekah, their sister and her nurse, and Abram's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gates of those who hate him." Then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Not only does she go like Abraham, she's blessed like Abraham. She's to multiply into numerous offspring, as has been promised to Abraham. Her offspring are to possess the gates of their enemies, as promised to Abraham in Genesis 22. And this reference to possess the gate of those who hate him points to a special descendant who will conquer his enemies, I think ultimately to the seed of the woman who will defeat those who are hostile to him. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. And so the fourth and final scene describes the meeting of Isaac and Rebekah. It shows Isaac accepting the bride chosen for him, and Rebekah taking Sarah's position as leading woman in the clan. Note that the chronology allows for 3 years between Sarah's death and Isaac's marriage. Though, the 2 chapters follow each other immediately, Sarah dies at 127 when Isaac is 37, and Genesis 25:20 tells us that he was 40 when he married Rebekah. In any event, the succession is secured. And Gordon Wenham writes, Very shortly after Abram's servant had been commissioned to find a wife for his son from Mesopotamia, the servant met Rebekah, who fitted Abram's specifications more perfectly than he dared hope. In fact, she was descended from Abram's brothers. She was beautiful and of the right age. And even her name, Rebekah, evoked the word for blessing, Berakah. And by her generous hospitality and willingness to leave home in response to the Lord's call, she showed herself to be both in faith and deed another Abraham. Her character inspires confidence that the next stage in the fulfillment of the divine purpose is in good hands. Even if Isaac should prove to be somewhat ineffectual, Rebekah, his wife, will be equal to the call. He got a good woman. And so we read finally that Abram took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Shurim, Letushim, and Leumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. So Abram's other sons become other nations. And Abram gave all that he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abram gave gifts. While he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So Abram sends the sons of his concubines, Hagar and Keturah, their children eastward, away from God, but Isaac is the one, as God intended, who receives the inheritance. And these are the days of the years of Abram's life, 175 years. Abram breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael his sons buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abram purchased from the Hittites. There Abram was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. Abram's death at 175 means that he has lived 100 years in Canaan. His life shows us how God wants to take us from fear to faith. That we may have ups and downs along the way, but God is willing to journey with us. That ultimately where he wants to take us to is a place where we can let go of whatever we're tempted to clutch onto for security out of fear, because we've come to trust him and to know his steadfast covenant love, that he will be faithful to us and take care of us in the end, that he will do as he promised beyond what looks possible and beyond the grave. He wants us to have the faith of Abraham, by which we can be confident, even in the face of age and death, that what God has promised us, he will deliver even beyond the grave.